the weeks following the storming of Bastille, King Louis XVI of France agreed to cooperate with the National Assembly, cooperate with the people of Paris to try and work out all the solutions to France's problems. Things appeared to be going quite well for him at this point, but in just 3.5 years, it would be decided that they should remove his head from his body. So what went wrong for Louis? Immediately after the storming of the Bastille, rumours went throughout France about the events in Paris, and the peasantry began to get very, very worried. They feared that the aristocrats, the rich people, would form armies to take control and to punish the peasants for what was happening in Paris. So the peasants began to form themselves into militia, began to arm themselves, and began to attack the houses of aristocrats, the chateau. They began to attack barns full of food and burn stuff down. And so this was a period known as the Great Fear. The peasants of France were scared that the aristocrats were going to come take military action against them, and the aristocrats were scared because the peasants were attacking their houses and massacring them whenever they could find them. Meanwhile, in Versailles, the palace just outside Paris, the National Assembly continued to meet, and they began passing some quite radical laws. One of them was getting rid completely of feudalism, the system of the three estates. They just got rid of it overnight in one law. They also issued a Declaration of the Rights of Man, which was a copy of the declaration which had happened in America a couple of decades earlier, where they declared that all men were effectively created equal. So really, really radical stuff happening. Meanwhile, in Paris itself, people were still short of food. They were still looking for bread, still unemployed. Now, this mob in Paris has a specific name, which is called the sans-culottes, and their name comes from the trousers that they wore. If you were a French aristocrat, you wore these natty trousers here, which were called culottes, which finished at the knee here, and were very stylish things. If you were just a normal Parisian labourer, you didn't wear these fancy culottes. You just wore your normal trousers, your pantalon. So you were without culottes. You were sans, which is French for without, sans culotte. So the sans culotte is a name that we use to refer to this group in Paris that was the driver of the revolution. And the sans culottes, they didn't have any food, and especially the women began to worry. But they knew that in the palace in Versailles, where the king's wife Marie Antoinette was, and the king was still with his family, that there'd be lots of food. So a large group of women marched out to Versailles from Paris. They marched the 12, 13 miles out to Paris, out to Versailles, and they demanded that the palace hand over bread. They decapitated a couple of guards. Some of them even broke into Versailles, is the palace itself, and into Marie Antoinette's chambers. And when Marie Antoinette heard that they wanted bread and they were without bread, just showing how distant she was, famously she said, "What do you mean they do not have any bread? Well, why don't they eat cake?" So clearly the sans-culottes, the women of Paris, were very angered by this attitude, and they basically escorted the royal family back to Paris. They put them in a disused, one of the king's disused palaces called the Tuileries, and there the sans-culottes, the Parisian mob, basically held the royal family captive. Now, as the months passed, Marie Antoinette, the queen, became very concerned for the safety of her family and of her husband, and they planned to flee one night. So they disguised themselves. Louis actually disguised himself as a butler, and they tried to flee to one of their stronger palaces out on the border, on one of the Parisian borders of France. And they actually got quite far, and they almost reached one of the safe houses. Unfortunately, on the way, they bumped into a postman called Drouet, who recognised Louis's face, clearly from the stamps, and he alerted the authorities in the next town, in a place called Varennes, and the royal family were arrested by the National Guard, and they were brought back to Paris. At about this same time, the National Assembly were getting more angry and angry with other countries like Austria, and a country which was called Prussia, which was effectively the eastern part of Germany, because they felt that they were harbouring dangerous aristocrats and against the revolution that was happening in France. So the National Assembly declared war on Austria and Prussia. Now, Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, was actually Prussian, and the National Assembly had effectively declared war on her brother by this stage. So things weren't going very well for the royal family. And then the National Assembly decided to change its name from the National Assembly call to the Convention. And eventually decided, the Convention, that they would actually abolish the monarchy, that the country didn't need the king anymore, he was practically useless, and so they declared that France was a republic. Now, during this time, there were lots of riots in Paris, there was lots of violence in Paris, because there were constant fears that the king and his supporters were going to try and seize back control. And so eventually, all this violence led to actually attacks on the Tuileries itself, on the King's Palace, and the situation became more and more tense. So eventually the Convention realised that maybe if the king stayed alive, then there would always be people who would try and put him back on the throne. So basically, after a show trial, they declared that the king had committed treason against the people of France, and they sentenced him to death by the guillotine. So on the 21st of January 1793, the king was led out to the guillotine in Paris, and his famous last words were drowned out by the sound of drums, and the guillotine separated his head from his body. The King of France was dead.